because my God says to be good to you. I think the first thing that we should be thinking, because we're in that situation, which we've all got variable reals in a reality that is arguable, and that we all rely on each other, then the first point of call is, okay, so what ethical obligations do I have in the first instance?
Hey, welcome everyone. So today it's Alex Phoebe on the podcast. This would be the first podcast we did, which is a video episode and in the lockdown. So hopefully you enjoy that. Alex is a writer, and some of you might already know him from his work and the books he have written, Lucia and Playthings. I've put the link down below the episode. One of his new book is Mordu, which is coming in August 2020. Now, if you are interested in subjective experience, psychology, or our relationship with reality, these are the perfect books to explore. Can't wait to have a conversation with him. Let's just welcome Alex Phoebe. So it's if anyone want to check out, it's on Spotify. So if you put Scholars in Spotlight, you'll find it. And otherwise, if you just put Scholars in Spotlight Greenwich on Google, there are a few different blogs and places where you can find the podcast.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll certainly have a look.
Perfect. So the first time I think I had a conversation with you was in 2018, June. It was, I think it was 13th of June.
Okay, good memory.
It's just but the reason why I remember is because it's book festival, so it's nearly at the similar
of course. Okay,
dates. Yeah, and we talked about Hyperion, Dan Simmons.
Right.
It's
a good book.
oh yeah, I would definitely want to explore that book some other time. But
sure.
But yeah, I always wanted to have conversation with you after that, because it was this like a conversation while an big event was going on, so we couldn't talk more than 5 minutes. So finally, this is the best excuse to talk to you, to book your time and do the podcast.
Okay,
let's maybe start with your latest book. Probably that might be an interesting, I think it's a bit of a different book than the few ones you have done before, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know, to be honest. It's certainly generically different. It's in a different genre, so that's true. And from an outsider's point of view, then definitely it doesn't look the same as the last two that have been published, because they were both obvious. They took a kind of real historical figure who has been written about academically and in all sorts of different ways, and dealt with that as the main protagonist. So this is a fantasy novel. So it deals with people who don't exist in places that don't exist, doing things that no one's ever done, that no one's written about, and no one knows anything about. So certainly it does look as if it's completely different. But from my point of view, it's no different from the kind of material that I usually write. The themes are the same. The attention that I pay to the writing is the same. My process is the same. And it's one of those things that people don't always remember when they're thinking about writers, is that the things that writers do and the things that readers read aren't the same thing. Quite often, the material that you eventually see in the bookshop under a person's name, while representative of the stuff they do, isn't by any means anything more than a sample. So this book feels like as much an Alex Phoebe novel as any of the other three, despite the fact that it would be the first one that anyone would have read of mine that is in genre, because all of my stuff so far has been sold to publishers of literary fiction. And now they're branching out. Gully Beggar are wanting to, I guess, take a risk on doing fantasy, but mostly because they know they've already read my stuff and they know that it's, well, it's not in the same genre, at least the kind of stuff that I'm known for writing. So it's not that unusual.
It's when you were mentioning it, I realized that you're right. Actually, some of the fantasy novels would make, you create characters and voices and you associate details. Some of the other works you have also done has to do with a lot of voices and a lot of internal subjective worlds, which
Yeah.
might feels very much somehow similar. It's actually accurate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there is one of the things that has always been of interest to me is the idea of what reality is, particularly reality as it's represented in literature. Excuse me a sec. And my feeling is that regardless of your subject matter, regardless of the kind of superficial content, all forms of literary practice, all writing novels, are fantasies of one type or another, even if they represent themselves as reals. So with something like Playthings, it's relatively obvious because it's about a schizophrenic judge, that person's reality is not the same reality as one that you could say was scientifically and objectively and empirically provable. And with Lucia Joyce, who also suffered mental health problems and was essentially silenced, any writing on her can't really be real either. So when you come to publish then a piece of fantasy writing, and people say, well, this is a change because it's fantastic, then it's effacing the fact that all writing is fantastic. They're just fantasies about different things. So if you can consider literary fiction to be a fantasy about the real, not all literary fiction, but some literary fiction, particularly English literary fiction, could be seen as a fantasy about the real, then fantasy is a fantasy about the unreal. And so, to a certain extent, people who have mental illnesses. So those things, fantasies about the unreal, even though they are set in the real. So it's much more complicated than thinking, well, now you've gone from realism into fantasy. The same techniques apply, the same interest applies. I think the difference with this new book is that it's much less focused on, as you were pointing out, one voice and one experience, and much more focused on a world. So it's like broadening the fantasy away from interiority and kind of subjectivity into something a bit broader.
Yeah, one research I was reading about fiction, people who either write fiction or read more fiction, pretty well done research, which is about that people who read fictionist character, or they are more emotionally robust because they are playing the real world scenario in their head and understanding,
sure.
and how they can somehow hold various
I
different
think I saw
point of
that
view.
too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is. I can never remember who made various quotes or the exact quote. Terrible memory, but there's something along the lines of someone who doesn't read lives one life, and someone who does read lives 100 lives. And I think that is definitely the case. And I think there's a case to be made for writing of any kind, but fictional writing in particular, for developing empathy and sympathy to a certain extent, and kind of giving people the opportunity to virtualize perhaps trauma and events that might happen to them, so that when they come to deal with them in their real lives, that they are not pre-prepared, but as you put, more robust in terms of the kind of level and range of things that they can deal with, because they've seen those things happen in fictional worlds.
I love it that you mentioned about exploring reality, because I got this word from this. I think he's a writer, Eric Davis. He write a lot about weird and cyber uncanny experiences,
Sure.
70s, like how to classify, well, I can't classify it. It's just he write about a lot of things, cyborgs and transcendence experiences, but he
Sure.
classify these things as real and reality. So real is something which is, let's say just a placeholder word, where something is very objective outside, and reality is our relationship to that real.
Yeah, sure.
And
well, I think, it's particularly for the writer, the blending between those two things is pretty much complete. So, and there's a tendency, I think, on the part of critics and readers to imagine that novels and say factual writing differ in some way, in that they're allowed to speak about different things. And I think that it's a mistake to imagine that you have access to that real. I think you have access to your reality in that sense, regardless of how you pitch your book, regardless of whether you say this is a factual book or a fictional book, or a fictional book that deals with facts, or a factual book that deals with fiction, whatever it might be. You're always kind of trapped in this reality situation, and the real is essentially not accessible to you. Not through words, certainly, I would have thought.
Yeah. So I want to ask a bit about what is one of your early experiences, or just overall. I mean, I don't think there's one early experience, so probably just a collection of different experiences which somehow motivate you to write about a lot of these characters' inner world, because it's a theme, I would say, that you have to explore one character and their inner world from a very subjective point of view. I don't know if I'm representing it correctly, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's accurate. And the answer to that question is I have no idea. I mean, it's not that. I think when you come to sit down to do something, you have certain intentions. Okay, and let's imagine there was an early Alex, from the past, who wanted to do things. When you sit down to do those things, then the act of doing it dictates what eventually gets done, one way or another. So you quickly come to understand the things that you're interested in doing, the things that you're capable of doing, the things that other people are interested in reading when you have done them. And that kind of takes out of the picture any kind of intentional, I'm going to go in and do this, because it never works that well. You never get to do the thing that you thought you were going to do, and you're never quite sure what it was you were going to do anyway. But I think realistically, to a more honest answer to the question, thinking about it, is that I was always interested in fantasy stuff when I was a kid. So and fantasizing, and I, it's not like I had a difficult childhood compared to a lot of people, but or that I was lonely. But I was certainly antisocial. I think I preferred to be in reading than out up and down the street kicking a football around, for example. So a lot of the stuff that I was doing was imaginative play of one type or another. I used to play with my brother a lot and make up stories for him, and storytelling and fantasizing of one type or another was always really central to the kind of stuff that I enjoyed. So I think that once you start doing that, and you kind of understand the world through thinking about things imaginatively, from reading books, from understanding media and films and TV and all those other kind of things, eventually it becomes obvious that you need to look inward. Otherwise you don't get to write your characters properly. So I've always been more interested in what makes people tick, and I guess psychologically speaking, that there may be some kind of unresolved issue with understanding the people around me, and how they work and how the world works. And it's I mean, I can't understand why everybody wouldn't do that. So perhaps I'm just overgeneralizing from my own position. But that would seem to be a reasonable way to go into the world, is to imagine what it is that you are thinking when you see that person. And then you have to try and understand who they are and what they're about. And I think that just represented itself very clearly in the first few books that I wrote, because they were very, very focused inward on particularly like aberrant psychologies. And I don't really know why that is. There are lots of glib answers I could give. One of them, I mean, it usefully, is that my wife was working as a mental health advocate during the writing of some of the material. So she was working for Mind, the charity Mind, at St Thomas's Hospital in London, and dealing with people who were sectioned under the Mental Health Act, for example. So people who were incapable of leaving by virtue of the fact that their reality didn't gel with the reality that the rest of the world experienced, particularly schizophrenics, who were very, very definite that the world that they lived in was true and real, despite the fact that everybody would disagree with them, to such an extent that if you refused to disavow the reality that you were espousing under your schizophrenia, then you weren't allowed to leave the hospital ever. So then the question then became, philosophically speaking, for me is, well, how certain is anybody of their reality? And why is it that we privilege some types of realities over others, and why lots of us can march around with very unusual ideas and not be imprisoned for them in one way or another? And it seemed like an interesting place to work at as a novelist. I mean, you can make up things and you can make stories and entertain people, but also there's the kind of impetus that you might want to try and understand injustices, is too kind of vainglorious a term, but things that might have gone wrong in the world. And the kind of things that Emma was looking at were very much things where you thought, well, but this is not fair. It's not fair that this person is kept imprisoned on the basis of their beliefs, even if they are pathological. And how far are we as individuals who aren't imprisoned ever away from that? And if you live in London, and even if you work at a university, it becomes pretty obvious that certain parts of the population, certain demographics, certain genders are far more predisposed to being accused of having unacceptable realities that lead them into imprisonment than other people. So I was looking at that kind of, what is it to have a reality that is so aberrant to the general society that it's going to get you imprisoned? So for someone like Schreber, that was 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century Germany. For someone like Lucia Joyce, it was mid 20th century to late 20th century Europe and Britain. And increasingly for everybody, it's now we are in a situation where you can find yourself at the other end of the authorities.
Yeah, I find it interesting, especially that here where we have a predominantly rationalist, materialistic belief systems, something which is pathologically, let's say, misfiring according to that view, which you were describing, it makes more sense to acknowledge that oh yeah, it is, of course, it's a hardware issue, so that's not the person's problem. And some of the cultures have actually found a different way around it. I'm sure you might have heard that they consider these people something of a gift. They have a gift, those they can talk to the other type of...
I mean, frankly, we do that in this country, and a lot of those people are called novelists, or they'll be called people who eccentrics. And then eventually you come down to what I think is unfortunately the case, is that it tends to be a class issue and often a race issue. It's a form of disciplinary action on the part of the state against people who it would seek to oppress. I can't think of a better word for it. And this is why you see a much higher rate of schizophrenia in young black men, for example, than you do in any other demographic of the population. Whereas the notion, even in English literature, of the wealthy aristocratic eccentric is very common, and yet there's no sense that any of these people are going to be put in in prison or in a hospital from which they aren't allowed to be removed. Instead, we kind of valorize their eccentricity and make a big show of how amusing they all are. I think that there's a kind of very uncomfortable antagonism between eccentricity and schizophrenia, which seems to be class-based. So all of those things make it a very fruitful place to write into if you're a writer, because you can start looking at those intersections and work out what that means for the world and what it means in terms of understanding your own reality. And particularly in times like this where everything's in flux, we have to now, the idea that somehow the market, it was the thing that was required in order to make sure everything worked, it's now being shown to be pretty much useless. The market for PPE, for example, is not a useful instrument for us in solving the coronavirus crisis, for example. And we're soon going to find out that all of those things that were unassailable realities, like capitalism and markets and laissez-faire government of one type or another, is not going to help us through these things. And then we're going to have to work out, well, what are the things that are real? And suddenly some of those things that people have been punished for believing Like, for example, the idea, I mean, you can take your pick, the idea that all things have a soul, for example. If you want to take some kind of animist view, which is a kind of considered in straight rationalist materialist culture to be a nonsense, might be a very useful set of ideas if we're going to have to start looking at, how we're going to deal with the world in a post-pandemic crisis, post-pandemic pre-ecological crisis. I think that negotiation between sense and nonsense and real and unreal and pathological and healthy, all of those things are going to be up for grabs. And I think they always were, but we get ossified in particular materialist, rationalist ways of thinking until they seem as if they must be true. And then when we find out that they don't help us, then we have to start thinking of other things that might be true.
I'm like extremely interested in this kind of scientific ground where people slowly are changing the beliefs. So some of the astrophysicists, some of the biologists who are really well respected now are criticizing some of the scientific models which somehow deteriorated into a very fixated states. And of course, as any system, it slowly start to become a bit tyrannical and a bit fixated on their own.
Also, I mean, I think people learn to negotiate the science often and the rational frameworks to their own ends. I mean, in this exactly the same way that eugenics tried to do in the 20th century, this sense that you could take evolution, which seems a reasonable set of beliefs, and then apply them in ways in which they're not useful, right, or not real, because they failed to understand very basic things. And I think it's possible for pseudoscientific, parascientific nonsense and to be very, very close and perhaps inseparable to the layman in terms of the way that it's articulated as you go through, as things start to become kind of put into the public consciousness. So things like rationality, things like materialism, things that have a very particular worldview tend to get debased over time to the point in which essentially they're being used pseudoscientifically for people's political gains. And to get back to the writing, that's largely what the first 3 books are about, and this next one is about how you use power. So it's rather than taking those kind of conditional things like what is a reality, what is it to be on the wrong side of reality, then you can move to what is it to use power. And I think this is where regardless of what real you want to occupy, or what real you want to believe in, or what real you can justify, what you do with that, particularly if you're in power, is the problem. And I think we've worked on the assumption that if you're in power, then you get to do what you like with it because you're in power. And consequently, no one should be able to question you because you're on the right side of reality. And you must be, because you have power. You've won reality. Reality is for you. And you've demonstrated your innate goodness by being successful within it. And I think very quickly it becomes obvious that that's not a helpful way of being in the world. Particularly when you see someone like pick Jeff Bezos, for example, making £2 billion a week and not then thinking, well, why don't I take this £2 billion a week and use it to do something useful with? There's nothing stopping Jeff Bezos being the savior and messiah of all humanity and fixing the problems with his enormous wealth. I mean, why aren't they doing that? Where are these billionaires fixing this? I don't see anybody doing it.
I think this might be one of the reasons why you find a lot of people who think that their reality, what they believe in, and what is helpful to them is the reality. So anything else. So if they would sometimes, I think it's just popped in my mind. Maybe that's why the subtlety of classifying some of the fictions, which would start to question those areas, which would start to bring back that otherness. They would say, oh yeah, that's escapism. Yeah, and it somehow, I just found it, even when I was a young kid, I found it really debilitating that I found that this book has allowed me and make me able to explore who I am and my reality, my relationship to the whole, and made it better. But why would you say that this is just escapism? But
Yeah.
I can see the tie and the suit,
Oh no,
unfortunately.
Ursula Le Guin is good on this. If you ever, she did a good speech when she won the National Writers Award of America, and
Hmm.
looking at what it meant to be a realist and what it meant to write fantasy and science fiction. And those things have been marginalized as childish and fantastic and escapist and all those other things. Whereas realism, particularly in English literature, is being where it's at. You've got to understand the real. What's the real world? And often the real world that realism deals with is a very privileged subset of what the world is, and doesn't tend to be about people with unusual views. It tends to be about, frankly, Oxford and Cambridge graduates and what a difficult time they have before they move into the banking sector. That's the literature of that part of society is very well handled by realism. Or you have like the kind of direct opposite, which is people who are living on the streets, and those two things kind of are put cheek by jowl, and occasionally there's a fad for one or the other. But I think you rightly point out, speculative work that looks in both science fiction and fantasy, that looks at cultures, looks at technology, and tries to make some kind of interesting thing to say about it, has been and still is relegated to the kind of the sordid back of the bookshop, and it's considered to be not something that a serious person would do. And I think that's ridiculous, and I think it's politically dangerous. I think, for one thing, it's a whole field of literary practice that people who don't get to speak like to read, for one thing, and secondly, it doesn't fall into that foolish error of imagining that only upper middle class people who were Oxford and Cambridge educated are allowed to have control of reality. And we're seeing that very obviously now, when you put a bunch of Eton educated PPE studying career politicians in control of the country, and they literally don't know what to do. They can't get a situation where they could get a factory up and running to produce medical equipment, which is a damning condemnation of anyone's ability to arrange something. I mean, it is not difficult, should not be difficult with the resources of an entire state, to mass produce masks. That's not the end of the world for anybody's ability to arrange something. I mean, and the fact that we're left with people who are kind of shrugging and looking vague and don't blame me. It's a difficult situation. You shouldn't be in a situation where those people have control of the real. That's a bad idea for everybody.
Yeah, markets, as you're right, like you mentioned it before, markets were considered to be, which I agree. Yes, markets are important if they are used. Well, that's again, there's, I mean, who knows what the markets are actually supposed to be like? What is their
Who knows
actual?
what one is?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean,
Yeah,
you've got to the point where they've made it so arcane, it's impossible to even understand what one is.
yeah,
I mean,
true.
particularly if you have complex derivatives that you're trading in. I mean, what does a market mean anymore when you're not even trading with the thing itself, but the risk of a thing increasing or decreasing in value over a set period? I mean,
Yeah, if someone is interested a bit to understand it, this evolutionary biologist, his name is Brett Weinstein, uh, or Weinstein, anyway. But yeah,
not a
either
good
of,
name,
yeah,
but yeah.
yes, either of those. He explains it as if there are four forces. If you can include, if you can inject those four forces in any of the ideology or phenomena, it becomes like it evolves, it becomes an organism of itself, and market is one of those, and market
Yeah,
fights for its survival like any
yeah.
other organism. And
But this is dangerously close to what we were saying before, which is a kind of pseudoscientific mumbo jumbo that is used to hide things, I think. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the case in this book, but the drift between metaphorically and allegorically dealing with the real via things that aren't it is very prone to get you into situations where you're trying to justify doing things that you really oughtn't to be doing. Whereas I think, and it's when you start looking at that level of abstraction that it starts to become obvious to the writer that there is very little separating someone's pathological understanding of reality and someone's rational understanding of reality, particularly when it's predicated on metaphor and allegory, which becomes so hard to unpick. Then all you're left with is, well, what class of person is this, and are they allowed to speak?
Yeah.
And if they aren't, because to describe a market as an animal, and that animal, which is a market, behaves in a biological way, and therefore we can start to use the terms of biology to look at the terms of the market, is if you were to say instead, the market is an elephant, and then keep on, if anyone ever asks you, just say the market is an elephant. What do you mean? Well, it's an elephant. It's a big animal and it's got a trunk. And you'd be like, okay, well, you have to come with me now. And then I'll put you in the asylum and you don't get to speak anymore.
Yeah.
And those kind of things, it's a nuanced and very fine kind of line.
Yeah. I think he was pointing out to this fact at the end of it, as in pointing it out that how if you come from different point of views, no matter what your point, like anyone's point of view of market is, like, or people who defend market or think that it's one of the most crucial things, without it society wouldn't function. Like he would use these examples to say that even then it's not functional in the end. Like whatever view of your reality, let's say, is, it's not functional according to the person's own full calculation, who is trying to present it as something which is completely functional. But it's just, you're right, it's a very it's an abstraction which is, it's million you can say factors in it, for sure.
Yeah, well, definitely. And certainly not, I mean, if someone was to present that level of abstraction to you and that level of allegory and said, okay, well, I believe in this aspect of it, but I don't believe in that aspect of the allegory, vote for me and give me all your power, then, what are you supposed to say? I mean, say, well, I don't really understand what it is you're talking about. And even if I did, I wouldn't know which side of this to come down on. So consequently, I don't have an opinion on whether you should be running the country or not. I mean, I don't know. It's tricky. I think, but yeah, I don't know where we've got to now.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Well, I actually wanted to, you might have thought a lot about maybe relationship with our trauma, and then trying to trauma and writing creativity, or just in general. And when we were talking about belittlings, let's say, people's attempt to understand what is the nature of our relationship to this thing we are immersed in, part of, rather than looking at it as a zoo, let's say. That's what we feel most of the time. We just feel that, oh yeah, this all reality is like a zoo, and we are somehow separated. But probably you, like, is it some sort of a collective trauma? Not collective in a way that it's somehow linked of each of everyone, but we are social beings, and we do connect with each other through language. So
yeah, sure. But I think that's the thing that you have to remember first. I mean, I think this is if that was something that colored everything that happened, I think this is what I'm trying to get at with the work, with the writing, is that regardless of all of that, regardless of what metaphors you use to describe reality, regardless of whether you might feel that one person is right and one person is wrong, regardless of the way that ideology affects things, the way that beliefs of one type or another affect things, or philosophical and intellectual frameworks, there is an essential obligation to everybody else around you who is in this with you, that you treat them with dignity and respect first, right? And not as a kind of byproduct of the market. I mean, or a byproduct of any particular way of being in the world. Okay, I am good to you because my God says to be good to you, or I am good to you because it's good for me as an employer to have good employees, so I will allow you to have sick pay and annual leave because that means you work harder for me, or I will make sure you get good wages because that allows you to buy my product, so I will be good to you for that reason. I think the first thing that we should be thinking, because we're in that situation, which we've all got variable reals in a reality that is arguable, and that we all rely on each other, then the first point of call is, okay, so what am I, what ethical obligations do I have in the first instance to the culture and the world that I find myself in, and not what do I think is right. And then that hopefully that whatever I think is right will work out right in the end. I think you should never be in a position to one, be so certain about whatever it is that you think you know, that you feel you get to act in an unethical way to people. And nor should you put that as the first condition. I must know the world as it is, and that the world as it is should be sufficient for me to act ethically. Instead, you should act ethically first and then worry about what the world is. Because it may well be that there isn't an is that the world is. It may be that there are multiple ises that the world is, and none of those are pin downable. So best to act ethically in the first instance. And I think that's what the books are essentially trying to say, is that no one, no matter how certain and definite they are about what they believe to be true, should use that as a basis for acting unethically, even if their ethical system seems then to allow for that. Like, for example, the idea that you would deny your staff sick leave because you know that that means that you would take a hit financially at your goods warehousing factory. Right? You should, of course, you should give people sick leave. Of course, you should, because they're human beings, and if they're ill, you shouldn't force them to work. That is your first question.
That reminds me of I think some practitioner of Buddha. He's a historian, but I forgot his. I don't remember who the person is, so I'm not going to mention it. But they were saying that, well, you can look at places where Buddhism itself exists, that it's probably not really working properly. But then the guy said that, oh, actually, this guy said, well, it's a really long game. I mean, who says that it's only few thousand years? The goal is that each and every single one of us do need to wake up and see from each other's eyes. So it's a long game.
It is a long game. I think that's true. I think that it's both long and quite short, because it is long in that the race is long. But like a marathon, you need to be ensuring that you're running in approximately the right direction. Otherwise, you never get to the end. I mean, you know that it's not okay for you to act like an asshole all the time. You know that. You don't have to wait to be told. It's just that somehow some people have been led to believe that it's okay for them to act badly because they're privileged and good. And they can do whatever they like because reality is such that it supports them. And obviously the striving for nirvana and kind of universal enlightenment across multiple regenerations is clearly a long game, but at the same time it has smaller individual failures and successes to reach some kind of accommodation with the world, etc., etc. I don't know, where did we get onto politics anyway? I can't help it.
Markets, it's fine.
Markets.
I mean, we are still putting politics into a larger context, so it's interesting.
And I think politics is very much to do with your idea of what the real is, and to do with what the self is, and all of those things. It's when you start taking those things for granted, and that they are something that means something outside of your local situation, then I think you get yourself in terrible trouble, because it lets you decide what's right and wrong. And the moment you're deciding what's right and wrong in that way, you're bound to make mistakes. It's wrong for lazy people to be rewarded for their laziness. It's wrong. That's clearly wrong. You can't be rewarded for laziness. Then the trouble comes in, well, what's laziness? And then you're in a problem, because you're just finding laziness, and there's always going to be margins to that laziness. No one's pure lazy. And even the people who are pure lazy doesn't stop them doing well. There's lots of very lazy people who do really well.
Now I think it's that's where it gets really hard, probably. I don't know, for me at this point, where it's yes, there is a there's a self-reflective subjective reality. That's where the culture is coming from. And we have this superpower in one sense, that we can separate a little bit from this deep now and plan into the future, and
Mm.
just we exist somewhere in between those timelines, and then we can create these virtual realities, and then we have these mirror where we just self-reflect and distort. Although, as you are saying, we gotta still rely on each other in this crazy
Mm.
situation, and still gotta go towards a bit of a direction which is not leading all of us and life into
Yeah,
some
in
sort of
one
a
area.
ledge, because it has happened many times on earth
Oh,
itself.
yeah,
So
please. And in very recent memory, I mean, sometimes I become annoyed. There's an argument that the nuclear deterrent has prevented war in Europe since the Second World War, and I hear people say things like that, and then I think, well, that's true if you ignore all of the wars that have happened in Europe, particularly the Bosnian conflict. I mean, we're not. I mean, I shouldn't laugh. We're looking at a situation where on mainland Europe there have been genocides in what is supposed to be the kind of the home of the rational West, and you look at the States and it's barbaric, the kind of oppression that black people suffered there daily. I mean, it's just a nonsense to imagine that any of these things are good, and we are all kind of galloping cheerfully off in one direction on the assumption that everything is right, and it only takes very small things, a disease that realistically is only what is it, 4 months old, and it's ground the entire culture to a stop. And that's not the first time this has happened. Just the Spanish flu is the most obvious, and that's within some people's living memory. I mean, increasingly few people, but there were people who were alive in 1918, and yet none of us seem to think that that was worth bothering with. Despite the fact that it's blindingly obvious that it was there, and it's effacing and overwriting the whole ecological kind of nightmare that we're all going through at the moment. But runaway overproductive capitalism we know it's causing global warming, we know it's ruining the planet, we know, and we're doing it anyway because it seems to be the right thing to do. It's all of those things, and to say, well, we do rely on each other, but we rely on the past of us and the future of us too, and all of those things are things that we have to bear in mind. We can't just, I mean, who even wants this crap anyway? I mean,
yeah.
I don't know about you, but I mean, during the lockdown, I've kind of come to the conclusion that I don't really need any of those things that I seem to have thought that I might have needed. Providing the food comes in, and no one's hassling me, I'm okay, I think. And I can remember times in my life when, if I'd have tried to go through this situation in those times, I'd have been in serious trouble. I mean, there were times when you've not had money for electricity because you had an electricity meter and the key wasn't charged up and you had no cash, right? And that was the only way you could get. How does that work now? How do people with electricity keys get electricity, right? I don't understand. I mean, you would rely on so many different people in order for you just to feel roughly comfortable in this situation. And any of those things that went wrong, if our boiler broke and this was the winter, then we'd be in trouble. If the water went down, if the internet went down, I'd be absolutely, that's it. There'd be nothing, I couldn't work. They'd have to fire me or something. I don't know what they'd do. Now is the most important person in my life, whoever it is who keeps the internet running. I guess, they probably are. I'm rambling.
No, yeah, I agree. It's an odd question, very odd, where we have separated ourselves from these natural signals, which somehow had some check on us. Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
diseases and wars. We have kind of maybe, I don't know, maybe it was a lot of suffering. We built walls, we have built cities, okay, and then we have maybe disconnected a lot from, if you want to call it, nature itself, which
Yeah.
was providing us guidance and it's
And other people. I mean, I
yeah.
sit and talk to the students, and we talk about stuff while we're doing, because people write about all sorts of different things in workshops. You look at other people's writing and talk about them, and often people will write about how terrible the world is and the ethics of the things that they're doing. And then we look around and we're all wearing stuff from Primark and whatever clothes you happen to have on. And everyone knows that those are made by slave children in other countries. Everybody knows that. and they know that's why it's so cheap, and they know that's why when you go to Morley's Fried Chicken, that whatever the chicken that you've eaten from Morley's Fried Chicken had a terrible life, terrible life, and that the whole of the culture that you're very much benefiting from is predicated on suffering, right? And somehow we've managed to make it so that we don't have to think about that all the time.
Yeah.
And I think, the pandemic, the way that people are dealing with the pandemic here on the news is like, okay, this is a terrible problem for the West, and it is a terrible problem for the West, but it's going to be even worse in places where they don't have a decent medical system, because we've enforced generations of debt, famine debt on them, and are forcing them to pay back the interest payments and not invest in their own infrastructure. I mean, what is going to happen in places? Well, how are we going to deal with that? People worried that they couldn't deal with Syrian refugees. What are you going to do when the entire infrastructure of countries throughout the world is just collapsed? What are they going to do?
Yeah, that's. I mean, I just want to figure right now about my own guilt. This is made in Pakistan.
And I think that's probably the way it works the whole time. I think that this is one of the reasons, I think, if you look at Chomsky, for example, who looks at the way the media treats the way we live our lives and forces us into an endless state of paranoid anxiety, precisely for that reason, so that we always think, I've got to look after myself, got to look after me and mine first, because if I don't, then no one's going to. And forget all of those people far away. I'll deal with them once my safety has been assured. And I think that is precisely how we end up in a situation where we don't come into those checks and balances from either nature or from other people. It's because we draw in our vision so closely on the people around us and forget the suffering of everybody else.
Yeah, there's a beautiful documentary called True Cost about this textile industry and the fashion industry.
Right.
Anyone interested in this topic?
Yeah, I should watch it.
Amazing, yeah, for sure.
See, I love depressing the hell out of myself. That's one. Sounds. I mean, what can you do? I mean, it's a terrible world.
Well, actually, there are something positives coming out of very scientific, like really dominantly scientific people who have authority. So there's this guy whose name is Jeffrey West. And the other guy, he's an astrophysicist, and the other guy is David Krakauer. They have Institute of San Jose, and they are working on complexity science, and they are trying to, break down these walls and the barriers. And one of the research they have done, beautiful, it's about this growth, this market, and the cities. They said cities is beautiful. I mean, it's one of the, let's say, it's a brilliant. One of the best inventions for humans in one sense, if you are looking at growth and if you're looking at how you can generate a lot of power, which you can then direct towards achieving something. But then they have done a really good calculations, and it's fascinating, the calculation, how they have compared cities with other organisms, because cities are not like separated from our world itself. So our biology is based in the suns and the stars, and somehow, and all of the calculation they have done describes that how of our age is dependent on many other calculation. But when they describe cities, it's actually one of the very unnatural calculation, and cities shows unlimited growth, and that's just a huge problem. And they show an unlimited growth to a point, and then there is no gradual decrease.
No, it just disappears.
Which is that's
well, it's not that. I mean, okay, well, you can imagine let's make an allegories in the other direction. If you start by taking a small amount of cocaine, you will eventually take an infinitely large amount of cocaine, right? And in fact, that the requirement to have more and more is built in, and eventually you just have a heart attack and die. It's the same. You can pump, or a balloon. All right, never mind cocaine. It's balloons. If you pump air into a balloon, eventually it pops. If we're looking for all these various metaphors.
That's a more user friendly.
Yeah, let's do that one. Cut it out. or
Okay.
whatever it is. Yeah, but
Yeah.
anything that it's an inflationary pattern, right? It's the
Yeah.
same with stop, busts, and booms. I mean, all of those things look like they're going to be brilliant and look like they're going to go on forever, and then the whole thing just dies. And you can see that throughout the entirety of history. We don't live in the Assyrian Empire anymore for good reason. It
Yeah.
got too
Yeah.
big and then it died.
Okay.
And then people went for smaller things,
Okay.
or
Before
the
I
Bronze Age collapse. Yeah, okay.
no, go say it, finish it.
No, fine. I'm not going to go into the Bronze Age collapse.
No, well, I mean, that's why I'm saying I don't think I can go any further. We have reached
Yeah,
pretty far back, but
yeah.
I do want to, before it ends, I do wanted to ask you about what is your relationship with the flow state or whatever you call that state? I don't know whatever
I don't know what you
your.
mean. The flow
Okay.
state, what, in terms of your practice?
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, flow state, they call it. Uh, Csikszentmihalyi is a researcher who, when when you're writing without your prefrontal critical self, which
Hmm.
is completely editing, but
Right.
sometimes you just really feeling like that you are just the medium. You know
Yeah,
how
sure.
people describe it. So how's your relationship with that? How do you go in flow state and check it back? What's
Well,
your.
it's we don't call it the flow state in creative writing, but that is it's pretty solid on from our discipline, which is you need to get yourself into a state in which you're not paying attention to yourself, right? Essentially, you're just typing, and your fingers are essentially transcribing, acting as a medium for whatever it is that you're thinking about, and that comes through. The more sophisticated you get as a practitioner, the more like finished writing that seems. But essentially, you're just acting as a conduit for whatever is. Um, you can use the metaphor of the unconscious from the Freudian end, that is just bubbling up from your unconscious. You're fantasizing and you're riffing in the same way that you would do if you were composing a piece of music on the fly, and then you just let that run. And generally for me that takes place over a course of a rather limited time period, until I have sufficient words to make up the length of a book, or I reach the end of a set narrative, a kind of narrative that I was thinking of. And basically you try and be as hands off with that as possible. So I start a new document every day. I riff on whatever word is the theme that I imagined I got to the end of last time, and then I let that run until I can't do it anymore. And then I do the same the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. Basically, not really thinking about it, not looking at it, not dealing with it at all, with the exception of occasionally anxiously wondering what it is that I'm doing, and trying to remember, what I was doing with these characters in these places, how I was fantasizing around their lives at the end of the last session, and then I begin the next, and then the forebrain editorial process happens on top of that. So the process of kind of communing with the muse, which is a kind of an earlier pre-Freudian way of describing it, is as free as it possibly can be. And then the rest of the material, the intellectualizing over the top of it, comes later. And then after that, there's the whole, kind of practical corporate end of getting the thing published
Do you
and changing it in ways that the reader might like.
do you think that about the 10,000 hours of that the thing about that, if you have invested somehow 10,000 hours into a craft, then it's much easier for you on the go to be go into the muse or
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to do the same thing all the time, certainly. If you try and do different things all the time, then a little bit, but not as much by any stretch of the imagination. I think 10,000 hours is a kind of very arbitrary seeming amount, and often you meet people who seem to be naturally good, and are capable of doing whatever it is that they do brilliantly well. There are lots of young students who come who definitely haven't put in 10,000 hours, who have what you would otherwise have to call talent, and they're capable of producing very good material very young. I think where the craft comes into it is in flexibility as much as anything. So I think it's both a matter of being able to master the basic techniques, but also to be able to deal with things, more than one thing, and to do things in response to other people's requirements of you. So I think the better at it you get, the more likely you are to be able to say, to rewrite a manuscript on the basis of the fact that somebody required something else from it. So, change your heroine into a hero, or set it in Greece. Those kind of things.
Yeah.
You can make those accommodations skillfully without making yourself feel like you've done something different. Unless you don't know what you're doing, at which point then you just have to throw your hands in the air and start something else. So yeah, I think practice definitely makes perfect, and all of these other platitudes. And you do have to put the hours in, and you do have to develop your skills and your range of behaviors. But it may be that once you've got 10,000 hours in, then subsequent hours to that aren't improving you and maybe reducing your ability, because I think sometimes there's a tendency to travel over old ground, and thereby do the same thing repeatedly, or to try to make whatever it is that you're doing sufficiently the same as the last thing that you did, so that you don't have to put as much effort in, because you've become used to your craftsmanship, and you don't like it when it feels uncomfortable, which is why I think it's always good to do different stuff, because then you're still having that kind of enthusiastic engagement with the craft that you did when you were younger and that carried you through to this point, rather than just trying to grind out whatever the next thing is that someone's asked you to do.
Perfect. Okay. No, I'm actually looking forward. I've read a bit of blurb from you for the new book.
Yeah, one day it'll come out, so fingers crossed.
Deeply anything to do with the underground or our shadows, I am hooked.
You're all over. Good.
Yeah.
What's your general area of expertise?
Well, it is to do with self conscious altering experiences.
Okay.
So real and reality, and also some sort of artificial intelligence, which is I would like to maybe call it transcendence intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, which is just so overused at this point that everything is artificial intelligence.
Yeah, sure.
So mostly conscious altering experiencing, learning itself. So that's what I'm personally really, really interested in.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of interesting material there. I mean, frightening, but interesting too. I mean, particularly it would be useful for this pandemic stuff. I mean, pattern recognition and neural nets and those kind of things are, are going to become very useful, I would imagine. There's lots of interesting stuff that I was seeing recently about the ability of neural nets to recognize not the causes of things like cancer, but the effects in large epidemiological studies. That means that they could then work back to see who was likely to have which particular disease at any given time on the basis of their presentation, despite them not having any pathological symptoms. Yeah. And those kind of like very wide and very deep thought activities would seem to be ideal for non-human intelligences.
That's a new hope, which I don't know how. I haven't checked it very recently, but it's to do with quantum computing. They are trying to at one point they're trying to figure out neural networks, which is not just predictive stats, simple algorithms, but truly neural networks which can communicate with each other and then build up as a kid builds up by interacting with the world and understanding in the safety.
Coming up with its own solutions.
Yeah.
Did you watch Devs?
Oh my God. Yes. Could you imagine that I actually started watching it just yesterday and finished 3 episodes? I'm going to binge watch it tonight.
It's nicely done. I mean, I don't agree with its position on determinism, but I won't tell you what happens at the end. So,
please don't. Yeah. No, I don't. I don't. I think he has talked, he has looked into string theory and he has looked into quantum physics, but not enough, because what he is talking about, there are some other physicists whose theories are really well known, would tell you about quantum physics, wave function, and
definitely
some of the things
the more specific his mouthpiece characters are on the science, the less convincing the whole thing becomes. If they just keep their gobs shut about it, then you could imagine your own physics into it, because some of it is kind of, it's, you know, it's the kind of stuff that you'd have talked about when you're at school, you know, and with your mates, oh, you know, imagine if type stuff. But, you know, it's still entertainingly done. And it's nice to see that guy out of Parks and Recreation, so kind of like widening his,
yeah, he's a different type of director, to be honest. He's really engaged in philosophy and science, and has a lot of subtext.
And it's hard. I mean, you want to be like popular, and you want people to be able to understand what you're saying, so you can't do it too complicatedly.
I do think that his yes, please.
Tell me what you think of the end when eventually you've watched it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks a lot, cool. Alex. Yeah, it was great.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. I would love to do something in the studio sometime when we are out of this.
If they ever allow us back into the campus, hopefully.
I guess. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
See you later.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.